Hi, I'm Kevin Kosar, and today's topic is the Office of Management Budget and how it can help with the out of control spending and the deficits that we currently have. Look, right now the federal debt is at $35 trillion and it is surging higher, maybe 37 come the end of the year. Congress at this point in time is away and they're campaigning for re-election. And even if they were here, legislators to date have collectively shown no real appetite to stop the gusher of red ink. It's a really troubling situation, but of course, it's not hopeless. We might get a new Congress come January that has the gumption to do something about the federal budget. But the executive branch also can play a role in cutting spending. And to discuss how that can be done, I have with me Dr. Vance Ginn. Dr. Ginn is an economist and the founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting. He's also the host of the Let People Prosper show and podcast. You'll see the link for that below. Dr. Ginn previously served in the Office of Management and Budget, so he can give us that insider's perspective on what this place is and what it can do here. So, Vance, thanks for making the time to chat with me.
Hey, Kevin, it's a pleasure with you, and thanks for all the great work you've been doing over the years and continue to do. So it really is a pleasure to be on the show with you.
Well, all righty. You are a rare bird. Not only do you have a PhD in economics, so that means you understand numbers and uh, goods and services and how the world works. You also worked at the Office of Management Budget, which is a rare privilege. That's inside the executive office of the president. Briefly, can you explain for listeners who are unfamiliar, what does OMB do? And then drill down and explain what your role was in that organization.
Yeah, it's something that was new to me too. For the most part, whenever I started there a few years ago, I really had to get up to speed quickly. But it's been around for a long time, nearly a century now, and it was really put in its current form underneath in the White House complex in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, right next to the White House, in 1971. But during the Nixon administration, where you had the Office of Management and Budget, it was the Bureau of the Budget within the Treasury before that for quite a while. And really what it does is it takes into account all of the budget that is legislated and passed by Congress and then determines where those dollars are going to go. OMB actually has a lot of power within the executive branch of the money that's going to flow to different agencies. There's also a period where the OMB director and others in senior staff, I happened to be on senior staff at the time. Russ Vogt was the acting director then, where I was the chief economist. It was actually called the associate director for economic policy at the Office of the Management and Budget. The first person who had this position was actually Art Laffer back in 1971, and then in 81, and under Reagan, it was Larry Kudlow. So you had some pretty big giants in the field of looking at what they've done in the past, and then I had this position from June 2019 to May of 2020. And it's really interesting to see the inner workings of OMB. There are different program directors when you look at different safety net programs, education programs, different programs within the executive branch that will then work with the Domestic Policy Council and others within the White House to formulate the policy vision for the president. And a big part of my job too, Kevin, was to what was called Troika. It's the three-headed monster, really, of the chief economist of OMB, chief economist of CEA, Council of Economic Advisors, and chief economist for the Treasury, who determine the economic projections in the president's budget. And so a big part of our job was to look at what's going on in the budget, how the monies are going to go out to different agencies, and really try to wean in, if we could, different places, the amount of spending that goes on along the way. But ultimately, of course, the budget's up to Congress, but we try to do our part where we could.
Yeah, that's true. The president, as part of the congressional budget process of 74, is supposed to submit a budget. It's supposed to go in by, I believe, mid-February each year. And yeah, that
The
begins
first Monday of February.
first Monday in February. Thank you
Yep.
for the correction. And that begins the conversation between the two branches. Uh, so from where you sit, if you were advising a new administration, OMB sitting there and thinking about getting into this process, what would you tell them to do? Is there some way that they can help in curbing spending?
Well, there is in the sense of when you go through these budget process discussions among different agency heads that will be brought in and just made through these discussions. What Russ and others did while we were there was almost a process of zero-based budgeting, where you start from scratch and you say, okay, or do we need these programs? And so there was a lot of questions back and forth about the different types of programs, along with getting what the president wants in the future. And I think that's something that should be done every year. I was only there at that time, so I don't know if that's done every year. But I think zero-based budgeting, priority-based budgeting, whether you look at states or local, or especially at the federal government, those are the types of things you really want to look at to make sure that you're meeting the goals for each one of those programs that were set out in the legislation. But there are other things too to look at when you look at sequestration. How much money could you have that you could pull back and not spend? There's a lot of excess funds that are being thrown around. How much money should there be? There was also a lot of determination by different agency heads of how money should be spent through regulations even. Some of that will hopefully be reduced in the future because of the Chevron deference case and how that was overturned. We'll see if Congress can actually make things a little bit more direct of how they want those dollars to be spent. But the other thing that's interesting here, though, Kevin, is that the budget that the president puts out that first Monday of February tends to be more of a ceremonial budget. It's a vision document for what the future is going to hold by each president that a lot of times, Congress just overlooks or doesn't do anything with. But I think that there could be a better job by the president using the bully pulpit to really rein in government spending. Because while budget hawks within, can you hear me?
Whoop, you're back. Yep.
Okay, good. Sorry. So while there was quite a few budget hawks within at OMB, President Trump wasn't necessarily a budget hawk, and so he wouldn't talk about a lot of these things like we would. And so I think that's also something that could be a better connection between what's happening at OMB, where we found $4.6 trillion in savings in the president's last budget, versus what the president is out speaking about. Those two things can go more in lockstep, which would then hopefully help Congress to get on board with passing some of those reforms. That's still an uphill battle, but I think that those are some ways that that OMB could really have more influence on driving home the idea that spending is the problem of government, and we've got to do something about it before we go off even a bigger fiscal cliff than we already are.
Yeah, that's a couple points I want to follow up on. You mentioned you guys found savings. For listeners who are probably going, oh, finding savings. What does that mean? Is it just spending less for certain stuff? Like, can you add some details on that to help listeners understand?
Yeah, some of that was spending less on certain areas of the budget compared with others, but there were also some tweaks. There were some tweaks that were done for Social Security disability. There were a lot of folks who were going on it for reasons that weren't intended earlier on when the legislation was created. And so we tried to streamline it basically back to where the legislation had it. And so that would have brought about some savings there. There are also some savings when you think about the disaster relief fund, the DERF, which ends up being a slush fund that's often used for different expenditures. We were trying to cut the amount of money that was also going into that fund, and that would also bring about some savings. And so a lot of these tend to be tweaks here and there, but you also can set priorities for the future about how you can rein in some of that spending. And I should mention that, of course, the $4.6 trillion in savings is over a decade. And we still have been running debts because this is another kind of Washington, D.C. speak where you say savings is just less than you otherwise would spend. Or if you're increasing the debt by 12 trillion, well, it's going to go by $8 trillion less than that, but it's still an increase in the debt. And so I think those are some key things of tweaks here and there that have big implications through compounding effects and other things within the budget, given that it is such a large budget over time. What's interesting right now, Kevin, as you know, is that the CBO has said that over the next decade, we're looking at about $20 trillion in increases in the debt. It's a massive amount of money. And then both people who are running now, Harris or Trump, has an even increase in the debt over that decade. So we still have some major problems that someone needs to take a deeper dive into these things back at OMB.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, you probably have heard that there's an idea out there. Elon Musk is he who created this took over the site X and created Tesla and all that. Elon has been talking about a government efficiency commission. And presumably, such a commission would only be working on the discretionary side of the budget. It would not be making the entitlements more efficient. But I guess in theory, perhaps it could have recommendations of that sort. That sort of commission, could you imagine like OMB having a formal role in it, or even a leading role, or would this be just a ledge branch thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. My guess is that OMB would have a pretty big role in that, given the amount of money that's floating around and the discussions that's happening within different agencies and agency heads. So my guess is that OMB would have an important role to play with whether it's Elon Musk or whoever it is in this efficiency. I would hope that when they looked at these levels of efficiency, it's not just whether a program is efficient, but also look to make sure that these programs are playing their constitutional roles, and make sure that the government is not doing things they shouldn't be doing to begin with. There is some of that happening at OMB now. Part of my team as Associate Director for Economic Policy was a group of PhD economists who would work on budgeting and modeling and stuff like that. But there was also a team for looking at effectiveness of the different programs. That was actually a bill passed by Paul Ryan before he left. And looking at that levels of effectiveness, I think is important. But one thing that we needed to also step back, and I try to get the team to do this more of, is how exactly should we even be spending these dollars? and when you start looking into that sort of level, that's where you can really find a lot of the savings, because there is some waste, there is some abuse and other things within government, of course. But at the same time, those aren't large amounts compared to the $6+ trillion budget that we have. And Kevin, also a big part of this is mandatory spending of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. I mean, that's 2/3 of the budget already. And then you're really left with a small portion of the budget to deal with discretionary spending. If you exclude defense, which some people would want to, you're even looking at a smaller share of the budget. And so at the end of the day, we really need everything to be on the table. And this is something that I think OMB could do a better job of, along with any sort of person who comes in to look at efficiencies. That even in national defense, there's a lot of excess money that's being spent that should be looked at, given the fiscal situation of us running $2+ trillion in deficits every year. And so I think these are all things that need to be looked at.
Yeah, certainly. And I'd be remiss if I didn't remind viewers, listeners out there that every year or so, the Government Accountability Office puts out a report where they identify redundant programs. The agency also identifies inefficiencies, and I've long wondered why that report doesn't get more uptake by the executive branch, precisely because you point out that the president is the lone political actor with the bully pulpit. Sure, we have some famous members of Congress, but the attention they draw just doesn't compare to what a president will get. I mean, they've got an entire press room in the White House. They've got the eyes of the entire world on there to be able to focus attention on certain things and to ask questions like, why do we have, I don't know, 7 different housing programs aiming at the same demographic? Why don't we just have one good functioning program?
Yeah. Yeah, and Kevin, another thing too to make sure we highlight for the audience is, they have to come up with 12 different budget bills, which they haven't done in decades now. At some point, I think there should be a discussion about changing that sort of budget process as well to maybe one consolidated budget. I mean, that's how most states are doing it now across the country. There are pros and cons, just like everything else. There are trade-offs. No solutions, only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell said. But at the same time, this system that we have now is not running very well when you think about the budget and all these continuing resolutions that just continue to kick the can down the road. This is not a way for a well-functioning government, a federal government, to run, in my view.
Yeah. And, as we alluded to earlier, the president has a peculiar position in it, insofar as, yes, he can submit a budget, but when Congress adopts a budget resolution, it doesn't go to the president's desk. They just choose to do it amongst themselves. And unfortunately, both chambers have not adopted a budget in some years. And when they do adopt it, it tends to be for the purpose of getting that vehicle of reconciliation through which they can then pass policies without having to amount to a super majority to get a super majority in the Senate. It's not about budgeting. It's about policy making, strong arming through one party or the other. So yeah, I mean, given the system that we have, it sounds to me like the next president, whomever we get, needs to step up and more deeply engage in budget policy because they're just uniquely positioned to set priorities and to create public pressure and attention on budgetary issues. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a lot of these issues are driven by what's happening with the budget. I mean, the budget really is a set of priorities. I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're looking at your family's budget and you start going through paying rent and food and other items, it's really setting a priorities. And the same thing should happen for a country. What are your priorities? Where do you want those dollars to go? And at the same time, remember the taxpayer, because the government has no money. It comes from us, the taxpayer. So the more that we're going to spend, the more that we're going to have to tax, either whether it's today through the form of actual taxes that we pay directly or indirectly through higher inflation, maybe higher interest rates and other sort of effects of longer term debt that we're going to have to face at some point as we're running $35 trillion in national debt and $1 trillion plus for just interest payments on the debt. The next president should really come in and take a close look at the budget. And I know that there's some discussion about, tax reforms. I mean, next year, Kevin, we're going to have a big year with the debt limit being reached and having to raise that. We also have probably a new spending bill, the new CR that's going to have to be, or hopefully a budget, but probably a CR. And then we also have the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiring, or the provisions for the individuals anyway. And so all those things are really it's going to be a major year. And I really think that they should start this with the budget though, because I would like to see the Trump tax cuts extended. But I also understand that there's a cost to that. And while I'm not a supply side economist that says if you cut taxes, it's automatically going to pay for itself. There are incentive effects and people are going to behave differently when you cut those taxes. But I really think we've got to get into both sides of the coin. Not only the taxes, but the spending side really matters a lot. And that's where OMB and the president and others within the executive branch can really play a big role to start to rein in how much we're spending and hopefully put some pressure on Congress to look at some key reforms to rein in that spending.
Well, all right. This has been a very interesting discussion. It's given me some hope for next year, but nonetheless, I'll still be holding my breath. There's so much at stake, so many balls in the air, and here's to hoping some sort of grand bargain pulls through. Vance, this has been an interesting discussion. It gives me hope, like I said, and thanks for taking the time to talk about OMB and to share with us some ideas about, where this agency fits that many people have never heard of in the process of figuring out a budget and trying to reduce spending to sustainable levels.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity, Kevin. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on these types of issues and others.